They say the Duke of Ravenhold never raises his voice. He doesn't need to. Lucian Draven built his empire the way winter builds ice, quietly, completely, without a single moment of mercy. Lords who challenged him found their trade routes severed before sunrise. Bloodlines that whispered his name in the wrong tone discovered what it meant to disappear so thoroughly that even their servants forgot they'd ever existed. But tonight, in the grandest ballroom in Valadorn, surrounded by the most powerful nobles in the kingdom, every one of them wearing his favor like a collar they'd chosen themselves, the Duke stood absolutely still while a woman looked directly into his eyes and didn't look away. Stay until the end, because what happens next will change everything you thought you understood about power. The snowstorm arrived 3 hours before Lady Seraphina Vale did, and Lucien Draven took this as either an omen or an insult, depending on which interpretation served him better. He stood at the high window of Ravenhold's eastern tower, one hand clasped behind his back, watching the iron gates below where his men stood, rigid in the driving white. The storm had descended from the northern ranges with the kind of indifference that reminded him why he respected natural forces more than human ones. Snow didn't negotiate. Wind didn't ask permission. The cold simply arrived and everything either survived it or didn't, and nature cared about the outcome exactly as much as Lucian did about most things, which was not at all. She was late, not by accident. His intelligence on Seraphina Vale was thorough enough that he understood this lateness carried intention the way a blade carries weight, deliberately, so the person on the receiving end felt the full significance of it. She'd departed Thornfield Manor 2 days ago. The roads were difficult but passable. A woman traveling with a modest retinue of 6 riders and 2 carriages could reach Ravenhold in 36 hours under these conditions. She'd taken 44. Lucian pulled his gaze from the gate and moved back through the tower room, which was not used as a sitting room or a study or anything so domestic. He kept it empty precisely because empty spaces made people uncomfortable, and when people were uncomfortable, they talked too much and revealed things they'd intended to conceal. He'd learned more about his enemies from the way they behaved in empty rooms than from any intelligence report. He descended the tower stairs without hurrying. Downstairs, Ravenhold breathed in its particular way, the low draft that moved through the obsidian corridors regardless of how many fires were lit, the almost inaudible hum of a fortress built into cliff rock, the total absence of casual sound. No one in Ravenhold laughed in the hallways. No one conversed above a murmur. This was not a rule he'd issued. He'd never needed to issue it. It had simply become true. Myron, his household steward, materialized at the foot of the stairs with the slightly compressed quality she always wore when delivering news she expected him to dislike. "My lord, the Lady Vale's carriages were spotted at the northern approach. She should arrive within the half hour." "And her escort?" 6 mounted riders, her personal maid in the second carriage. No military retinue. Lucian absorbed this. No military escort from Thornfield meant one of 2 things. Seraphina Vale was either arrogantly confident in his protection or deliberately signaling that she arrived as a guest rather than a negotiator with leverage. He found himself uncertain which, and the uncertainty was interesting enough to note. "Have the entrance hall prepared, not the formal reception chamber." He paused. "The library antechamber." Marin's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The library antechamber was not where guests were received. It was where Lucian conducted the more consequential conversations, the ones where he needed to observe how people behaved when they understood they were being assessed rather than welcomed. "As you wish, my lord." He moved toward the great hall, hands still clasped behind his back, the familiar weight of Ravenhold settling around him like armor. He had agreed to this arrangement with the Vale family because the alliance was rational. Their southern trade routes complemented his northern military access in ways that would take a lesser house a decade to replicate through other means. Lord Edmund Vale, Seraphina's father, was an intelligent enough man to understand what he was offering when he proposed his daughter as the mechanism of this union. The word proposal made it sound almost gentle. It wasn't. It was a calculation, which was the only kind of arrangement Lucian respected. What the intelligence reports had not fully prepared him for was the secondary material. The accounts from 3 different sources, none of them coordinated, all of them arriving at the same conclusion, that Seraphina Vale was not the typical instrument of such calculations. His primary source, a merchant who moved between Thornfield and the capital and owed Lucian a debt of the lasting variety, had written, "She runs the household accounts herself. Not the domestic accounts, the trading ledgers. Her father consults her. His secondary source, a noblewoman who'd attended 3 seasons of court alongside Serafina, had noted with the barely concealed bitterness of someone describing a rival. She never appears uncertain. Even when she's wrong with such complete conviction that you find yourself wondering if perhaps you were the mistaken party. The third source was the most useful because it was the most reluctant. A minor lord who'd attempted to negotiate a separate trade arrangement with Thornfield before Lucian's approach had been finalized. The man had written to a mutual acquaintance, and that acquaintance understood who paid his debts. She listened to every point of my proposal in complete silence, and then declined it in 11 words. I counted afterward because I needed to understand how she'd done it so efficiently. Lucien had read that letter twice. Efficiency in refusal was, in his experience, rarer than any other social skill and considerably more revealing of character. He reached the ground floor corridor and slowed as he passed the portrait gallery, the long procession of Draven ancestors rendered in oil and martial bearing. His grandfather wore the expression of a man who had never in his life considered whether his choices were correct, only whether they were complete. His father wore the same expression minus the confidence, which was how Lucien had understood early that confidence and correctness were not related quantities. His father had been wrong about nearly everything, and absolutely certain about all of it. Lucien paused at his own portrait, the one commissioned 3 years ago at the insistence of the court painter who claimed it was traditional. He'd never liked it. Not because it was unflattering, it wasn't, but because it had captured something he hadn't intended to display. The painter, whether through skill or accident, had rendered him with an expression that looked less like authority than like vigilance, like a man watching for something to go wrong. He moved on before he could think about what that meant. The library antechamber was small by Ravenhold's standards, which meant it was larger than most receiving rooms in lesser houses. Bookshelves lined 3 walls from floor to ceiling, filled with volumes that were actually read rather than displayed, their spines worn in the honest manner of use rather than the calculated manner of staging. A fire had been built in the iron grate. 2 chairs faced each other across a low table on which someone had placed a carafe of dark wine. Lucien moved the carafe to the side table. He sat in the chair facing the door, crossed one leg over the other, and waited. He was extraordinarily good at waiting. It was perhaps his most useful quality, the one his enemies consistently underestimated. Men who moved constantly telegraphed their anxiety. Men who required activity to feel purposeful revealed the poverty of their inner resources. Lucien had learned to be still the way cliffs are still, not through passivity, but through the complete absence of any need for the moment to be different than it was. He heard her before he saw her, not her voice, her footsteps. Most people arrived at a room with the slight adjustment in pace that indicated awareness of imminent assessment, a barely perceptible slowing, a preparation. Serafina Vale's footsteps in the corridor outside carried no such modulation. She was walking at the same pace she'd apparently been walking everywhere since she arrived at Ravenhold's front gates, which, based on the rhythm, was unhurried but entirely unintimidated. The door opened. She was taller than he'd expected. This was the first thing he registered, and he registered it quickly because he had trained himself to process physical information before social information, having learned that physical realities were harder to manipulate than social ones. She stood perhaps 5.5 feet in the charcoal traveling dress she'd apparently not changed from, which was either practical or a calculated refusal to perform the expected transition from traveler to guest. Her dark hair was dressed, but not elaborately so. She was not wearing the kind of jewelry that announced wealth. She wore the kind that announced restraint, which announced something more interesting than wealth. She looked at him. This was also not what he'd expected. Most people who entered a room where Lucien Draven was seated performed some variation of the same sequence, a visual sweep of the room, a settling of their expression into whatever face they'd decided to present, and then a look at him that had been somewhat prepared during the room sweep. Serafina Vale's gaze went directly to him, immediately, with the quality of someone who had already decided where the primary feature of any room would be and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. It was not deference, it was assessment. "You received my message about the delay," she said. It was not a question. "I received notice that you would arrive today rather than yesterday," Lucien said. The cause was not specified. The cause was my choice. She crossed the room without invitation and sat in the chair across from him, an act of presumption so complete that it failed to read as presumptuous. more like someone sitting in their own house who'd simply extended the courtesy of acknowledging another person was also present. I needed a day to understand Ravenhold before I arrived inside it. Lucien looked at her steadily. You spent a day observing my fortress from the outside. From the village at the base of the cliff, the people who live in the shadow of a great house understand it differently than the people who serve inside it. She met his gaze with the same directness he'd noticed from the moment she'd entered. Their understanding seemed relevant. For a long moment, the fire in the grate was the only sound. And what did they tell you? He asked. That you're fair to the village, which surprised several of them when they said it, as though they hadn't entirely formed that opinion until the question prompted it. A slight pause. They also told me you haven't raised the trade levies in 11 years, which every neighboring duchy has done at least twice. They told me the roads between here and Millhaven are the best maintained in the northern territories. They told me, she said, with the quality of someone delivering the most significant item last, that they've never feared Ravenhold itself, only the consequences of crossing it. Lucien was quiet. This was the kind of intelligence he would have gathered himself. It was, in fact, precisely the kind of intelligence he had gathered himself. About every house he'd approached, every family he'd considered doing business with, every person he'd decided either warranted his attention or did not. The difference was that no one had ever walked into his receiving room and opened with it. You conducted reconnaissance on me, he said. I gathered information before walking into an unfamiliar situation, she said. I assumed you'd done the same. I have 4 separate intelligence accounts of your activities over the past 18 months. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, quite. More like the beginning of one that had thought better of itself. Then we're well matched for this conversation. He studied her for a moment with the same attention he gave to maps before a campaign, looking not at the features he expected, but for the ones that would matter under pressure. She was composed in a way that didn't read as performance. There was no visible effort in her stillness, which meant either she was genuinely at ease or she was exceptionally skilled at appearing so, and both possibilities were equally worth understanding. You know what this arrangement is intended to accomplish, he said. I know what my father intends it to accomplish. I know what your advisors believe you intend it to accomplish. She tilted her head slightly. I'm less certain about what you actually intend. Political alliance, trade consolidation. The advantages are apparent. The political and commercial advantages are apparent, yes. Her voice didn't shift in tone, but something in the sentence's construction made the word apparent do unusual work. I'm asking about your intentions regarding the marriage itself. The directness of it landed in the room differently than he'd anticipated. Not because it was inappropriate. In any rational exchange, such a question was entirely reasonable, but because most people, in his experience, spent considerable effort approaching the center of a conversation by way of its perimeter. She'd simply walked to the center and stood there. The marriage is the mechanism, he said. Mechanisms can function in different ways. A key and a lock are both mechanisms. She held his gaze. I'd like to understand which one you consider yourself. Lucien felt something he didn't often feel in conversations. The particular attention that arrived when he was genuinely uncertain how an exchange would conclude. He spent most conversations several moves ahead of their other participant, not through any exceptional cleverness, but through the exhaustive preparation that came from taking everything seriously enough to study it properly. He was not certain he was ahead of this one. That depends, he said carefully, on what doors you're carrying. The silence that followed was the first silence in the conversation that felt genuinely shared. Then she said, I should change for dinner. She rose, and the ease of the transition was as complete as everything else about her. No performance of dismissal, no strategic lingering, simply the movement of someone who had concluded the portion of time she'd allocated for this particular exchange. At the door she paused, not with the hesitation of uncertainty, but with the deliberateness of someone who had planned to pause here. The village at the base of the cliff also told me one other thing, she said, without turning. He waited. They said you keep your promises. She glanced back, and for a moment the assessment in her gaze was entirely unguarded, which was somehow more arresting than everything that had come before. I think that's the most important thing anyone could have told me. She left. Lucien sat in the chair beside the fire for a long time after the sound of her footsteps receded down the corridor, and he was aware that his own stillness had a different quality now. Not the stillness of someone waiting for something to begin, but the stillness of someone realizing something had already started. He reached for the wine. He'd had it moved aside because guests expected hospitality, and he had no interest in performing hospitality. He poured himself a glass now, in the empty room, for entirely different reasons. The dinner that evening occupied the long table in Ravenhold's secondary hall, which seated 30 with ease and was therefore intimate by the standards of any formal gathering here. Lucien had arranged it that way deliberately. Not for warmth — warmth was not a quality he cultivated in any environment — but because large rooms during early negotiations allowed people to perform for multiple audiences simultaneously, which divided their attention and produced the kind of polished responses he had no use for. He wanted to see how she ate dinner. This was, he recognized, a more particular objective than most hosts brought to the first formal meal with a visiting dignitary. But Lucien had long since accepted that the specific nature of his attention was unusual. He had learned more about the character of potential allies from watching them navigate a meal, how they spoke to servants, how they handled the moment when a dish arrived they hadn't expected, how they managed the performance of social ease, than from any number of strategic conversations. Seraphina Vale arrived in a gown of deep navy that was neither the most expensive thing she owned nor the least, and the calculation in that choice was invisible enough that most people wouldn't have identified it as a calculation. She wore her hair differently now, still restrained, but with the kind of adjustment that acknowledged this was a different context without making an announcement of it. She sat across from him, and the 8 members of the household present understood, with the accuracy that came from serving Lucien long enough to read atmospheric changes, that this was not a normal dinner. The conversation at the table moved through the predictable territory of its first hour: the weather, the road conditions, the early prospects for the spring trade season. Lucien spoke little, which was not unusual. His household counselor, Lord Aldrich, managed the social scaffolding with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood that his function at these meals was to create the conditions for other things to happen. Seraphina engaged with the table conversation with the quality of someone genuinely interested in what other people were saying, which Lucien had learned to distinguish from the quality of someone performing genuine interest. The distinction was subtle but real, and it was located primarily in whether the person's follow-up questions connected to what the other person had actually said or to what the other person had been expected to say. Hers connected. "You mentioned the Eastern Road," she said to Lord Aldrich. "Do the levies from Millhaven still apply to grain transport specifically, or has that been renegotiated?" Aldrich glanced at Lucien with the reflex of someone checking whether to answer or defer, and Lucien gave him nothing, which Aldrich understood meant answer. "The grain levies were renegotiated last spring," Aldrich said. "Reduced by a third. The arrangement was the Duke's initiative." "I imagine the farming households found that significant," Seraphina said. "They did," Aldrich confirmed, "though it was not advertised." "No," she said, and her gaze moved to Lucien for a moment. "I imagine it wouldn't have been." He met her look across the candlelight and said nothing. After the third course, the conversation at the table had relaxed enough that pockets of private exchange became natural, and it was in this reordering that Seraphina leaned slightly in his direction and said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "The man on your left, Lord Aldrich. He's afraid of you." Lucien was quiet for a moment. "Most people here are." "No," she said. "Most people here are cautious around you, which is different. Lord Aldrich specifically is afraid. The way he checked your face before answering my question, that's not caution. That's the learned habit of someone who has experienced genuine consequence for unauthorized speech." He looked at her with the attention he reserved for information that required reassessment. "You've known him for an hour," he said. "I've watched him for an hour. It's not the same thing." She picked up her wine glass, unhurried. "I'm telling you because I think you don't notice it anymore. Not because you're indifferent to it, because it's become the normal atmosphere and people stop perceiving the normal atmosphere." The precision of this observation arrived in him somewhere behind his sternum, in the place where things landed that were both accurate and unwelcome. "And what do you propose I do with that information?" he asked. "Nothing, necessarily. I'm not proposing. I'm just telling you what I see." She glanced at Aldrich briefly, with something that wasn't sympathy exactly, but was the more useful cousin of it. "He seems to be genuinely good at his work. It might be worth knowing what he'd do if he wasn't afraid of getting it wrong." Lucien looked at Aldrich then with the specific quality of attention the observation demanded. Not the ambient awareness of a man surveying his household, but the focused assessment of someone actually looking, and saw, with a clarity that was somewhat annoying in its belatedness, that she was right. He returned his gaze to her. "You make a habit of this," he said. "Of what?" "Saying things that are true and also uncomfortable. Only to people who seem capable of handling both qualities simultaneously," she said, and the trace of something at the corner of her mouth this time completed itself briefly before receding. He held her gaze. "And what have you determined about my capacity in that regard?" She considered this with the quality of someone who took questions seriously rather than treating them as invitations to deploy a pre-prepared response. "Undecided," she said finally. "You receive the truth without visible reaction, which could mean you're processing it or suppressing it. I haven't yet determined which." "Perhaps I'm doing neither," he said. "No," she said, with a quiet certainty. "You're doing one or the other. A man with nothing happening internally looks different from a man managing what's happening internally. You're managing." He felt something in his chest that was, if he was being precise about it, uncomfortably close to the sensation of being known, which was a sensation he had organized his entire adult life to avoid. It was not pleasant. It was also, and this was the part that required the most careful examination, not entirely unwelcome. After dinner, he walked the upper corridor alone, as was his habit. The hours between the end of the evening and the beginning of sleep were the only time Ravenhold felt genuinely his, not as a seat of power or a strategic resource, but as a place where the architecture of his thoughts could move freely without requiring management. He stood at the window overlooking the courtyard below, where two of his soldiers moved through their late patrol, their torches cutting orange arcs through the falling snow. She was not what he'd prepared for. This was not a small acknowledgement. Lucien Draven had built the entirety of his operational success on the principle that thorough preparation made surprises into merely inconvenient deviations rather than genuine disruptions. He had prepared for a capable woman, an intelligent woman, even a strategically formidable woman. He had prepared for the possibility of conflict in this arrangement and the possibility of productive alliance and several variations between those two poles. He had not prepared for the specific sensation of sitting across a dinner table from someone who looked at the mechanics of how he'd built his world and saw them, actually saw them, and kept looking anyway. He turned from the window. 3 days into the formal engagement period, the court dynamic shifted. It shifted the way weather shifted in the north, not gradually, but in a single definitive recalibration, after which everyone understood that the previous conditions no longer applied. The shift was not caused by anything dramatic. It was caused by a corridor conversation that 3 separate parties witnessed and subsequently described to 4 others each. Lord Perrin Castle, one of the lesser nobles who maintained his position at Ravenhold through a combination of usefulness and careful political navigation, had approached Seraphina in the portrait gallery with the specific quality of attention that Lucien recognized, and which Seraphina apparently also recognized, as the kind that preceded an attempt to establish terms. Lucien was not present. He heard about it from 2 sources within the hour. Castle had, with the careful indirection of someone who'd practiced the approach, suggested that Lady Vale might find her time at Ravenhold more comfortable if she cultivated certain alliances, by which he meant his, and that the Duke's engagements were known to fall through under the right circumstances, by which he meant circumstances that he and people like him were in the business of engineering. What Seraphina had said in response was reported slightly differently by each witness, but the core was consistent. She had looked at Cassell for a long moment, in the way she looked at things she was genuinely thinking about rather than preparing to perform a response to, and then she had said, "Lord Castle, I want to be clear about something. I'm not here because I was sent. I'm here because I assessed the situation and made a decision. Which means, if you're planning to destabilize this arrangement, you're not working against a woman looking for an exit. You're working against someone who chose to walk through the door." Then she'd returned her attention to the portrait she'd been examining. Castle had apparently stood in the corridor for a noticeable period of time before walking away. The story moved through Ravenhold the way stories move through any closed system, quickly, with the particular velocity of information that changed how people understood the balance of things. By afternoon, it had reached everyone whose position made them worth reaching. Lucien read it in the atmosphere of the evening's council meeting, a subtle recalibration in the way certain people held their posture when her name came up in passing. Not deference, quite. Something more interesting than deference. Reassessment. He found her that evening in the library, which surprised him, though he recognized he should have anticipated it. She was in the east alcove with a volume from the military strategy shelf, which he identified from the spine color before she registered his presence. Morin's commentaries, he said from the doorway. She looked up without the starting quality of someone caught. You've read it 3 times. He entered the library. It's more useful than it appears. Most people assume it's primarily historical. It's primarily psychological, she said. The military analysis is the surface argument. The actual argument is about the relationship between information and judgment. She looked down at the page she'd been reading. He argues that good commanders consistently overestimate the quality of their own information and underestimate the quality of their enemies, which seems like it should be obvious, but apparently requires 600 pages of historical evidence to convince people. Lucienne took the chair across from her reading corner, which required a slight rearrangement of the lamp. You heard about Castle, she said, not a question. I heard several accounts. I imagine they were consistent in the essentials. They were. He looked at her. You understand that handling it that way makes you a different kind of problem for certain people here. I handled it the way I was going to handle it, regardless of the consequences, she said, without particular emphasis. If the consequences are that people understand I'm not negotiable about certain things, that seems like useful information for everyone to have early. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind against the library's high windows had the quality of persistence, the kind of cold that didn't announce itself but simply kept arriving. Cassell has been useful to me, Lucian said, not because I trust him, because he's predictable, and his usefulness and his predictability are connected. I understand. She met his gaze across the lamplight. I didn't damage his usefulness to you. I just made sure he understood the specific geography of this situation. A pause. He was attempting to recruit me as leverage. That would have made me a problem in your house. I chose not to be. Lucian looked at her for a long moment. You're protecting the arrangement, he said. I'm protecting my position within it, she said, with the precision of someone who understood the difference between those 2 statements, which happens to be the same action. He thought about Morin's argument about information and judgment, about the gap between what you believed you were working with and what you actually had, about how that gap was the most reliable predictor of strategic failure. He had believed he was working with an intelligent woman who would be a useful alliance mechanism. He was becoming increasingly certain that this was a significant underestimation. You should finish the chapter, he said finally. The argument in the 3rd section connects to something he establishes in the 2nd that most readers miss because they treat the sections separately. She looked at him with the particular quality of someone accepting a piece of information as both practically useful and revealing of something else. You're recommending I read your copy of a military strategy text. I'm telling you the reading order that makes the argument coherent, he said. What you do with it is your concern. The trace of something at the corner of her mouth, the one that had made its full appearance once at dinner and retreated, returned. This time it stayed long enough to be unambiguous. Thank you, she said. He rose and moved toward the door and was nearly through it when she said behind him, Duke Draven. He stopped. I want to ask you something, and I'd like you to consider answering it honestly rather than strategically. He turned to face her. She had put the book down and was looking at him with the direct quality that he was, by now recognizing as simply her register, the way some people were consistently loud or consistently gentle. She was consistently direct, not as a performance, but as a characteristic. The portrait in the gallery, she said. The second from the left in the Draven succession line. Not your grandfather, not your father, the one between them that has no nameplate. He was very still. You had the nameplate removed, she said, but the frame dimensions match the others, and the painting style is from the same period, which means it was a full member of the succession line and was deliberately unnamed. Her voice carried no accusation, only the quality of someone who needed to understand the things they didn't understand. I'm not asking about the history. I'm asking why you kept the portrait. The fire in the grate behind her was the only sound for a moment that stretched longer than the library's silence usually allowed. Because removing it entirely would have been a pretense, he said finally. And I don't practice pretense. She looked at him with the unguarded quality that had arrested him during their first conversation. Not sympathy, not analysis, simply the full presence of someone who was actually listening to what had been said. The chapter in Morin that explains his central claim, she said, is Section 4, not Section 3. But I think you knew that. A pause. I think you wanted to see whether I'd just take the instruction or verify it. He held her gaze across the firelit library for one long moment. Then he said, "Get some sleep, Lady Vale. Tomorrow is a full court day and the wolves will be watching." He left before she could answer. But walking back through the corridor toward his own chambers, Lucien Draven was aware of a sensation he had not experienced in years, the particular alertness of a man who has just realized that the territory he thought he knew has features he hasn't fully mapped yet. It was almost identical to the feeling of preparing for a campaign. Almost. The difference was something he couldn't name precisely enough to examine yet, which was, itself, the kind of thing that kept a man awake in the dark hours before dawn, listening to the wind against stone and the deep silence of a fortress that had never, not once in the years he'd ruled it, felt quite like this. He had 4 more days before the formal engagement was to be announced before the assembled nobility. He was no longer certain those 4 days would be sufficient for the kind of recalibration he suspected this situation demanded. He was also, and this was the part he intended to spend the next several hours examining, not entirely certain that the insufficiency troubled him the way it should. 3 hours before this court assembling, as Lucien reviewed the morning correspondence in his private study, his intelligence officer Severin entered with the particular quality of movement that meant the news wasn't logistical. Lucien set down the letter he was reading. "Roland Varick arrived in Valadorn capital 2 nights ago," Severin said. "He's been in private meetings with Lord Castle's brother." Lucien was still. "And the content of those meetings?" "Unclear as yet, but Varick's man was seen near the Vale family's Valadorn correspondence house yesterday morning." Severin paused. "Before Lady Seraphina arrived here." The implication settled in the room with the weight of something structural shifting. Lucien looked at his correspondence for a moment without seeing it. Roland Varick. His rival for northern influence for a decade, a man who operated with the patience of someone who understood that the right destabilization at the right moment was worth more than any direct confrontation, had been in contact with the Vale family's correspondence channel. Before Seraphina arrived. Before. Which meant either Varick had approached the Vale family and been refused, in which case the information was merely historical, or Varick had approached the Vale family and established something, in which case the woman currently reading Morin's commentaries in his library was not what she appeared to be. And the 4 conversations he'd had with her since her arrival had been constructed with a precision that would, if accurate, represent a level of strategic sophistication he had not encountered in 20 years of navigating the most lethal political environment in the kingdom. "Who confirmed the timing?" Lucien said. 2 separate watchers. "The timing is reliable." He was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the absolute flatness that the people closest to him had learned meant he was somewhere behind it. Not empty, but the opposite of empty. So completely occupied with whatever process was occurring internally that nothing was available for external registration. "Don't move on this," he said. "Watch Varick's man. Watch the Vale correspondence house. Bring me everything." "And Lady Seraphina?" He picked up the letter he'd set down, not because he intended to read it, but because the gesture closed the question. "Continue as planned," he said. Severin left. Lucien sat alone in his study with the cold morning light falling across his desk and the sound of the wind against the high casements and the absolute silence of a man confronting the possibility that the most interesting person he had encountered in years might also be the most dangerous threat he had ever allowed inside his walls. The court gathering was in 3 days. He had 3 days to determine the truth. And somewhere in the corridors of Ravenhold, moving through his house with the unhurried directness of a woman who seemed to have no reason to hide anything, Seraphina Vale was waiting for the morning to begin. Brat. The question was no longer whether she was extraordinary. The question was whose extraordinary she was. And by the time Lucien Draven had that answer, it might already be too late to matter. The morning came in cold and without ceremony, the way all mornings came at Ravenhold. Gray light pushing through stone casements, the distant sound of soldiers changing watch, the low structural settling of a fortress that had stood long enough to have opinions about the weather. Lucien had not slept. This was not unusual. He slept in the way he did most necessary things, efficiently, briefly, without sentiment about its absence. What was unusual was the specific quality of the wakefulness, the way it had not been the productive wakefulness of a man working through a strategic problem, but something less organized, more resistant to the kind of clean analysis he relied on. He had sat at his desk until the candles burned low and reviewed everything Severin had given him about Roland Varick's movements. The timing was exact. Varick's man at the Vale Correspondence House, 3 days before Seraphina's departure from Thornfield. Enough time for a message to be sent and received. Enough time for instructions to be adjusted. The problem was that none of it was proof of anything. Proximity to a correspondence house was not conspiracy. Men with business interests visited correspondence houses. The Vale family had trade connections across Valadorn that had nothing to do with political maneuvering. The fact that Varick was in the capital meant exactly as much as any powerful man being in the capital, which was not, on its surface, anything. What troubled Lucien was not the evidence. It was the specific texture of his resistance to the conclusion the evidence suggested. He had built his entire operational life on the principle that the interpretation you wanted to be true was the most dangerous one available. Men destroyed themselves by selecting the reading of events that required the least painful adjustment to their existing understanding. Lucien had made a discipline of doing the opposite, of choosing, deliberately, the reading that demanded the most of him, because that reading was statistically the most accurate. The reading that demanded the most of him now was that Seraphina Vale had arrived at Ravenhold with a purpose beyond the one declared. He found this interpretation almost entirely unpleasant, which was, by his own logic, the strongest argument in its favor. He was still at his desk when Maren knocked at 7 with the morning correspondence, and the quality of his silence when she entered told her everything she needed to know about whether to speak. She set the letters down and left without a word. He dressed without calling for assistance, which he preferred, and was in the corridor by 7:30 when he heard her voice from the direction of the eastern courtyard. Not speaking to him. Speaking to one of the stable hands, a young man named Corin, who had been with the household for 2 years and was, by any measure, the least consequential person on the Ravenhold staff. Lucien stopped at the corridor's edge. "The gray mare," Seraphina was saying. "She favors her left foreleg when she comes out of a cold stall. Has she been seen by the farrier recently?" Corin's response was surprised, and then earnest. "No, my lady. He didn't think so. He'd noticed it too, but hadn't thought it was his place to—" "It's absolutely your place," she said, and her voice had the quality he'd heard at dinner when she spoke to people she'd decided were worth her full attention. Not the performed warmth of condescension, but the straightforward attention of someone who considered the information relevant. "You're with her more than anyone. Your observation matters. Tell the stablemaster today." A pause. Then Corin, quietly, "Yes, my lady. Thank you." Lucien moved back from the corridor's edge. He stood in the stone alcove for a moment, aware of the specific sensation of being recalibrated by something small. It wasn't the content of the exchange that required the recalibration. It was the complete absence of audience management in it. She hadn't known he was there, which meant this was not the behavior of a woman performing accessibility for strategic purposes. It was just who she was. He filed this information in the same place he'd been filing everything about her since she arrived, the place that was becoming inconveniently full. He stepped back into the corridor and rounded the corner into the courtyard. She was already looking in his direction. Either she'd heard him, or she'd simply expected him. He couldn't determine which. And both possibilities were equally characteristic. "You're up early," she said. "I'm always up early." "I know." A slight pause. "Corin told me you do a full perimeter walk at 6 before anyone else is moving. He said the soldiers find it unsettling." "The soldiers find it clarifying," Lucien said. "There's a difference." "There is," she agreed, and the quality in her voice was the one he'd come to recognize as genuine amusement rather than performed lightness. Though I imagine from their perspective the distinction requires some time to appreciate. He looked at her in the gray morning light. She was dressed for riding, practically, without the kind of costuming that announced a woman expecting to be observed on horseback. The cold had put color in her face, and her breath moved in small visible clouds between them. "I'm going to ride the Eastern Ridge," she said. "You can accompany me or assign someone else. I won't pretend I don't notice the difference." He held her gaze for a moment. "Give me 10 minutes," he said. They rode out through the eastern gate into the white landscape beyond Ravenhold's walls, 2 figures on dark horses moving through a terrain that had the particular quality of northern winter. Not picturesque, not brutal, simply vast, with the kind of scale that made everything human feel provisional. Lucien rode beside her rather than ahead of her, which he recognized as a choice he'd made without deliberating about it. and which told him something he wasn't entirely prepared to examine yet. They rode in silence for the first quarter mile, and it was not the silence of people who had run out of things to say, but the silence of two people who were, for the moment, occupied with the same landscape and found it sufficient. Then she said, "You've been thinking about Roland Varick." His hands on the reins did not move. His horse's pace did not change. He gave her nothing external to read, which was, he was aware, itself a response she was reading. "What do you know about Roland Varick?" he said. "That he's your primary obstacle in the Northern Territories. That he's been patient about it for a decade in the way that patient men are often more dangerous than aggressive ones." A pause, and she kept her eyes on the ridge ahead. "And that his man was outside the Vale family's correspondence house 3 days before I left Thornfield." Lucian's horse moved through the snow. "You knew," he said. Not a question, not an accusation, the flat statement of a man determining the shape of his terrain. "I was told," she said, "by my father's secretary, who noticed the man and recognized him because he'd seen him at a trade negotiation 2 seasons ago." She glanced at him then, with the directness that was her register. "I debated whether to tell you immediately or wait to see how you handled the information when your own intelligence brought it to you. And what did you decide?" "I decided to wait." Her voice was even, not apologetic. "Because how a man responds to the appearance of threat tells you considerably more about him than how he responds to direct information." The cold moved between them with the quality of something being examined. "You were testing me," Lucian said. "I was learning about you," she said. "There's a difference. Testing implies I already knew what result I was looking for." He looked at her in profile. The set of her jaw, the easy way she held herself in the saddle, the absence of any performance of contrition for the admission she'd just made. "And what did you learn?" he said. "That you don't move immediately when you're uncertain. You gather. You wait for pattern, rather than acting on single data points." She paused. "That's not common in men with your level of power. Most men in your position have been rewarded for fast action often enough that they default to it even when it's wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "Varick contacted your family," he said. "Yes." "Before you came here?" "Yes." "And the substance of that contact." She turned her horse slightly on the ridge, and they slowed to a walk, and she looked at him with the full directness that she deployed when she had decided a moment required it. "He proposed an arrangement," she said. "He wanted access to Vale trade routes in exchange for political support against the Draven Alliance. He framed it as protecting our family's independence from Ravenhold's consolidation." "And your father's response?" "My father referred it to me." Lucienne held her gaze across the distance between their horses. "And your response?" he said. "I declined it," she said, "without consulting my father further, which he was not entirely pleased about, but which was necessary because his instinct would have been to negotiate rather than close the door entirely, and a half-open door to Roland Varick is considerably more dangerous than no door at all." The wind moved across the ridge with the particular persistence of northern cold, and the snow stretched out below them in every direction, and Ravenhold stood on its cliff behind them like a fact about the landscape that had always been true. "Why are you telling me this now?" Lucian said. "Because you were going to find the shape of it through Severin within 48 hours, and when you did, you were going to have to decide whether the incomplete picture you had was enough to act on." She held his gaze steadily. "I'd rather you have the full picture and make whatever decision you make from an accurate position, even if the full picture works against your interests." "My interests are best served by your accurate understanding of the situation," she said, with the precision of someone who had thought this through to its logical end. "If I manage your perception of me, instead of giving you true information, I have a short-term advantage and a long-term liability. You'll eventually find the truth, by men like you always do, and at that point whatever I've built here is worth nothing." He looked at her for a long time. The part of him that had spent 20 years navigating the space where everyone had an agenda was performing its habitual analysis, checking the internal consistency of what she'd said, looking for the gap between the story and its supporting logic, searching for the place where the architecture of a constructed account revealed itself through some small asymmetry. He didn't find one. "Varick's man was watching the correspondence house," he said, "not inside it, which means he was observing whether you made contact with Varick's network after your arrival here." Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly, but the quality of a person encountering a mind that has caught up with them faster than expected. "Yes," she said, which means Varric isn't certain you closed the door. He's hoping you reconsidered. Yes. Which means, Lucy said with the flat certainty of a man who has just identified the pressure point in a structure, that Varric believes the arrangement is still open, and an open arrangement is leverage he'll move on before the formal engagement announcement. 3 days, she said. 3 days, he confirmed. They held the look between them across the cold open air of the ridge, and something in it was different from the looks they'd exchanged in the library and at dinner and in the corridor, less the quality of assessment and more the quality of two people who have arrived by different routes at the same piece of ground. What do you need from me? She said. The question landed in him with a weight he hadn't expected from 5 words. Not what will you do? Not what does this mean for the arrangement? What do you need from me? With the full implication that she was prepared to provide it, that she had already made whatever private calculation was necessary and had come out the other side of it committed. Nothing you're not willing to give, he said, because it was the only answer that fit the question as she'd actually asked it. She nodded once, with the quality of someone accepting terms they've already accepted internally. They turned the horses back toward Ravenhold, and the fortress rose against the gray sky ahead of them, and Lucian was aware, in the way that a man becomes aware of a structural change in something he's known long enough to stop examining, that something in how Ravenhold looked to him had shifted. Not the stones, not the gates, not the architecture of authority he'd built inside it. Something about what it looked like from the outside. He didn't examine this further. There were 3 days before the engagement announcement. Roland Varric was moving. The court would assemble tomorrow for the first formal presentation of the prospective Duchess of Ravenhold, and every pair of eyes in that room would be calculating. He needed to be thinking about none of the things he was currently thinking about. He needed to be thinking about Varric. Instead, he was thinking about the quality of her voice when she'd said, "What do you need from me?" The absence of performance in it, the completeness of the offer. By the time they reached the inner gate, he had constructed a plan for Varric that was as close to airtight as 48 hours allowed. He had identified 3 points of pressure, 2 contingencies, and 1 surgical move that would close the open door permanently if executed correctly. He had also identified, with the uncomfortable precision of a man who has trained himself to be accurate about the things he'd rather not examine, that the plan he'd constructed was not solely about neutralizing a political threat. Part of it, the part he would not have admitted to any living person in the kingdom, was about making certain the situation that had put her in proximity to Roland Varric's maneuvering could not recur. Not because the alliance required it, because the thought of her being used as anyone's leverage, anyone's, produced in him a response that was not political in nature. He handed his horse to the stable hand without speaking and moved through the gate into Ravenhold's courtyard, and behind him he heard her say something quiet to Corin about the grey mare, and the ordinary human decency of that small exchange in the middle of everything felt, for reasons he could not have cleanly articulated, almost unbearable in its accuracy. He had 3 days. He intended to use them. What he did not know, could not have known, because Severin's full report had not yet arrived, was that Roland Varric had not waited for the 3-day window. He had moved the night before. And the document now sitting in a sealed envelope inside Ravenhold's own courier system, addressed to the Crown's judicial office in the capital, bore the Vale family seal, a seal that had been, with considerable skill and considerable malice, forged. The accusation inside it named Serafina Vale as a conspirator in a plot against the Northern Territories. It was designed to reach the capital in exactly 42 hours. 12 hours before the engagement was announced. And the only person in Valadorn who could have produced a forgery that precise was someone who had been inside Ravenhold long enough to study the seal. Someone who was still inside it. Severin's full report arrived at noon. Lucien read it standing at his desk, and by the second page, something in the quality of his stillness changed, not visibly, not in any way a casual observer would have catalogued, but in the way that a building changes in the seconds before a structural failure, the load-bearing elements making their adjustments in silence, while the surface continues to appear unchanged. The forged seal had been produced inside Ravenhold. That was the fact around which everything else organized itself. Not near Ravenhold, not in the village below the cliff, not in the capital, not in any of the dozen locations where Varric's network maintained operational capacity. Inside. The quality of the forgery, the specific impression depth, The wax composite, the deliberate aging of the document's paper, required access to the Vale family correspondence materials that Serafina had brought with her in her traveling case. The traveling case that had been in her chambers since she arrived. The chambers to which 3 people in Ravenhold held keys. Lucien set the report down on the desk surface, with the careful placement of a man who is managing the precise amount of force his hands are currently interested in applying. He looked at the page for a moment. Then he looked at the wall. Then he looked back at the page, because the wall had nothing to offer, and the page had everything, even if everything was not what he'd been prepared for. 20 years. 20 years of building a system so thorough, so layered, so comprehensively considered that the people closest to him were not trusted because he was naive about human nature, but because he had constructed conditions in which betrayal was irrational. The calculus of loyalty at Ravenhold was not sentiment, it was architecture. He had made himself the most reliable source of protection, advancement, and consequence in every direction for the people who served him, and that architecture had held because it was built on accurate assessments of what people actually needed rather than what they claimed to value. He had been wrong about one of 3 people. He moved to the window. Below, the courtyard was occupied with the ordinary morning business of a large household. Supply deliveries, guard rotations, 2 of the kitchen staff crossing toward the eastern outbuilding. Normal. The surface of things maintaining its appearance, while the structure underneath had just revealed a crack he hadn't known was there. The 3 people with chamber access were Marin, his household steward, Aldrich, his household counselor, and a junior attendant named Wes, who had been assigned to Serafina's quarters specifically to ensure her comfort during the visit. Marin had been with him for 11 years. He had watched her navigate 3 succession crises in the household, 2 attempted infiltrations by rival houses, and 1 situation involving a visiting lord that had required her to make a decision entirely on her own initiative that had been, by any measure, exactly correct. He had never once questioned her loyalty, not because he was sentimental about it, but because her loyalty was rationally explicable. She had built her life inside Ravenhold's structure, had more to lose from its disruption than from any competing offer, and had demonstrated her judgment under pressure consistently enough to constitute a pattern rather than an exception. Aldrich. Lucien stood at the window and thought about what Serafina had said at dinner 3 nights ago. He's afraid of you. The learned habit of someone who has experienced genuine consequence for unauthorized speech. He hadn't wanted to examine that observation fully when she'd made it. He examined it now with the exhaustive attention it deserved and found, underneath it, a second observation she hadn't made but which was implicit in the first. A man afraid of consequences might, under the right pressure, decide that a different set of consequences was preferable. Varric would have known this. Varric had been watching Ravenhold for a decade. He would have identified the weak points not in the stone, but in the people. The ones whose loyalty was based on fear rather than calculation, whose adherence to the structure was maintained by the absence of a better option rather than the presence of genuine alignment. The moment a better option materialized, or was manufactured, the architecture failed. Lucien called for Severin. When Severin appeared, he was already reading the implication in Lucien's face, which meant it was visible, which told Lucien more about his own current state than he was comfortable knowing. Aldrich, Lucien said. A pause of perhaps 2 seconds. Then, he left the main building twice last night after the household retired. The first time he returned within the hour. The second time, Severin stopped. The second time, Lucien said, he was gone for 4 hours. I have him returning through the servants' entrance at 3 in the morning. The courtyard below continued its ordinary business. The kitchen staff had disappeared into the outbuilding. A soldier was adjusting his post position near the eastern gate. The courier, Lucien said, left at dawn, before I had the full picture. Where is Aldrich now? His chambers. He's not scheduled to appear until the pre-court briefing at 2. Lucien turned from the window. Bring him to the map room. Don't tell him why. Don't tell him I know anything. A pause. And find Lady Serafina. Tell her I need to speak with her before the briefing. Don't tell her where I am. Severin left. Lucien stood alone in his study with the document on the desk and the fire in the grate, and the particular quality of the knowledge that he had, for the first time in a very long time, failed to see something coming. The map room was on the 2nd floor, with no windows facing the courtyard. a room designed for the kind of conversations that required the absence of ambient information. Maps covered 3 walls, campaign records, and trade route analyses layered over each other in the organized density of a man who thought in systems. It was Lucien's most honest room. The study was for administration. The library was for thinking. The map room was for the space between thinking and deciding, where the shape of things became clear enough to act on. Aldrich arrived with the quality of a man who had prepared for a routine meeting and found himself in different territory the moment he crossed the threshold. It took him approximately 3 seconds to read the room. Lucien saw the precise moment it happened. The slight adjustment in Aldrich's shoulders, the recalibration of his expression from prepared to something underneath prepared, the way his eyes moved to the door and then back with the reflex of a man remembering that the door was no longer a useful option. "Close the door," Lucien said. Aldrich closed it. "Sit down." He sat. His hands, resting on the table, were still. But still in the way that required effort, which was a different quality than the stillness that required none. Lucien looked at him across the map table for a long moment without speaking. This was deliberate. Most people, in the silence of being looked at by someone who knows, begin to generate words, filling the space with preemptive explanation, justification, the verbal architecture of a defense they haven't been asked to make yet. The words themselves were not what Lucien wanted. The shape of the words, the place where the architecture started, told him everything about the internal structure of what had happened. Aldrich held the silence for longer than Lucien expected. Then he said, "How much do you know?" Not a denial. Not a question about what this meeting was regarding. How much do you know? The question of a man who has already decided that the specifics of Lucien's knowledge are the only relevant variable. "Enough," Lucien said. Aldrich's jaw tightened. Something moved through his face that was not quite fear. Fear had a specific quality Lucien had learned to read precisely, and this was something adjacent to it but different, closer to exhaustion. The expression of a man who has been carrying something that was too heavy for the distance he had to travel with it, and has finally, with a combination of relief and dread, set it down. "He came to me 6 weeks ago," Aldrich said. "Varric, his intermediary. A man I'd known from the capital, It wasn't a stranger." A pause. "He told me the alliance with Vale would expose Ravenhold to a consolidation that would eventually render the northern territories subordinate to the combined Vale-Draven interest, that the Duke's judgment had been compromised." His eyes came up. "By the prospect of the woman." Lucien said nothing. "I didn't believe it immediately," Aldrich said, and the quality in his voice was the raw texture of a man being honest about something he would have preferred to frame more favorably. "I watched. I looked for evidence of it. And then she arrived, and I watched the way you—" He stopped. "Finish it," Lucien said. "The way you listened to her." Aldrich's voice was flat now, stripped of preparation. "You don't listen to people. Not the way you listened to her at dinner. Not the way you— I've served you for 9 years. I've watched you conduct negotiations with kings. I have never seen you rearrange your attention for another person the way you rearranged it for her that first night." His hands tightened briefly on the table. "Varric said it was already too late, that she had leverage over you, that the only way to protect Ravenhold was to remove her from the equation before the engagement was formalized. The fire in the corridor grate was audible through the closed door. Somewhere below, a horse moved across the courtyard stones. And the seal," Lucien said. Aldrich looked at the table. "I took an impression from her traveling case, the wax composite I gave to Varric's man 3 nights ago." A pause that had the weight of a man looking at something he cannot unsee. The document was supposed to reach the capital before you could intercept it. The accusation would require a crown inquiry. The inquiry would delay the engagement indefinitely. Varric believed that was sufficient, that without the political timeline, the arrangement would dissolve on its own. "And what did you believe, Lucy?" Lucien said. Aldrich looked up. His face had the quality of a man who has arrived, through a sequence of decisions that each seemed smaller than they were, at a place he would not have recognized as a destination at the beginning of the journey. "I believed I was protecting the house," he said. He stopped, started again. "I told myself I was protecting the house." The silence in the map room had a different quality now, not the silence of a confrontation approaching its breaking point, but the silence of something that has already broken, and both people in the room know the shape of what's on the ground. "The courier left at dawn," Lucien said. The document reaches the capital in 36 hours. The engagement announcement is in 24. He held Aldrich's gaze. Where's Varric's intermediary now? Aldrich told him. Lucien stood. He moved to the door and opened it, and two of his soldiers who had been positioned in the corridor stepped into the room with the competent efficiency of men who had understood their instructions precisely. He looked at Aldrich one more time. 9 years. The calculation of that number. The weight of what 9 years of proximity meant, of what had been built and what had just been made irrelevant, moved through him in a single compressed second. Not sentiment. Something colder than sentiment and more accurate. The acknowledgement of a loss that was real without being the kind of loss that permitted any response other than what came next. Take him to the lower chambers, Lucien said. He's not to have contact with anyone. He walked out. In the corridor he stopped, one hand against the stone wall, and stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, with the particular quality of a man whose internal architecture is performing rapid load redistribution. The betrayal was not the thing that was taking up the most space. The thing taking up the most space was the specific accuracy of what Aldrich had said, the way you listen to her. You don't listen to people, not the way you listen to her. He had known this already, on some level that operated below the clean surface of strategic analysis. He had known it the way you know a structural shift in familiar ground before you can articulate what you felt change under your feet. Aldrich had simply named it in the plainest possible terms, and the plainness of it had arrived in him like cold water. He pushed off the wall and walked. He found Serafina in the east corridor, which meant she'd been on her way to him when Severin found her, which meant she'd already understood that something had shifted in the household's atmosphere and had moved toward it rather than away from it. He noted this. He noted it with the part of him that was still cataloging information, even while the rest of him was doing something considerably less organized. She looked at his face and said nothing. They walked together to the library where they would not be overheard, and he told her in the precise, stripped-down account of a man delivering battlefield intelligence. The forgery, Aldrich, the courier, the timeline. He gave her the facts in the order that made the shape of the situation clearest, and he watched her receive them with the stillness of someone whose first response to crisis was to understand it completely before responding to it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Can you intercept the courier?" she said. "Yes. I have riders who can reach him before he crosses into the capital district." "Will intercepting it stop Varric?" "No," Lucien said. "It buys time. Varric will have a contingency. Men like Varric always have a contingency." She nodded once. Her eyes were on the middle distance, not unfocused, but working, the quality he'd seen in the library when she was moving through the implications of Morin's argument, that particular inward attention of a mind that treats problems as territory to be mapped. "The forgery used my seal," she said, "which means even if you intercept the document, Varric can claim the original was sent, and the interception was Ravenhold suppressing a legitimate accusation." She looked at him. "He doesn't need the document to reach the capital. He needs the existence of the document to become known." Lucien looked at her. She was right. The document was not the weapon. The knowledge of the document was the weapon. And Varric, who had placed his intermediary where Lucien's intelligence would find him, who had constructed a timeline that gave Ravenhold just enough warning to respond visibly, Varric had not intended the document to work. He'd intended the response to the document to work. Every move Lucien made to protect her would read, to an outside eye, as a man suppressing evidence against his intended bride. "He's not trying to prevent the engagement," Lucien said, and heard in his own voice the specific quality of a man arriving at understanding a second too late to feel clean about the delay. "He's trying to make the engagement the instrument of Ravenhold's vulnerability. The moment I visibly protect you, I confirm that my judgment is compromised. Every action I take on your behalf becomes evidence for the accusation." "Yes," she said, "which means the only clean response is one I take from a position of documented distance from you." She held his gaze. "Which means publicly, you cannot protect me. The fire in the library grate, the wind against the high windows, the absolute stillness of a man who has spent 20 years building a system in which the right answer was always available if the analysis was thorough enough. Confronting the specific situation in which the right answer and the answer he was prepared to give were not the same thing. There is a version of this," she said carefully, "where you release me from the arrangement on the grounds of the accusation's investigation, publicly. It protects Ravenhold's political position. It gives Varric what he says he wants, which removes his stated justification for further action. And you, Lucian said. I return to Thornfield. The investigation proceeds. The forgery will be demonstrable eventually. The seal composite won't match under proper examination. It takes time, but it's survivable. She was offering him the clean exit, the rational move, the one that preserved Ravenhold's operational integrity and gave Varric no further leverage, and allowed Lucian to return to the architecture of his life before the last 5 days had reconfigured its most load-bearing elements. She was offering it without any visible indication of what it would cost her to have it accepted. That was the part he couldn't get past, not the logic of it. The logic was sound. The logic was, in fact, exactly what he would have arrived at himself if he were advising someone else on their situation. The part he couldn't get past was the absolute composure with which she was handing him the door and the complete absence of any performance of not minding if he walked through it. He looked at her in the firelight of the library that she had walked into on her second night at Ravenhold and read his books with the directness of someone who treated other people's spaces as places they were genuinely allowed to occupy. And he felt something that was not a strategic calculation and was not a political assessment and was not any of the clean categories he had organized his interior life into for 2 decades. It was closer to the sensation of recognizing, with the clarity that arrived too late to be comfortable, exactly what was at stake. No, he said. She waited. That's not the move we make. Lucienne. Her voice was careful but not gentle. If you act to protect me openly, Varric has exactly what he needs to... I know what Varric has. His voice was quiet, and the quality in it was something she hadn't heard from him before. Not the cold authority of the Duke of Ravenhold, not the measured intelligence of a man thinking through a problem. Something underneath both of those. I know exactly what he has, and I'm telling you that the move we make is not the one that sends you back to Thornfield while a forged document determines the next year of your life. She looked at him for a long moment with the full directness of her attention. Then what is the move? She said. Lucian looked back at her, and behind his eyes something had settled. Not the stillness of management, not the stillness of a man maintaining the surface appearance of control, but the stillness of a man who has moved through the doorway of a decision and is now standing in whatever room comes after it. We stop trying to intercept what Varric is doing, he said, and we make him show his hand in a room where I choose the terms. The engagement announcement, she said slowly. I'm going to let him come, Lucian said. And he will come, because men like Varric cannot resist being present for the moment they believe they've won. She was still looking at him, and in the quality of that look was something that was not yet relief, but was the precursor to it. The moment before a person allows themselves to believe that the ground under them is going to hold. This puts everything on one move, she said. Yes. If Varric has something we haven't anticipated, then we lose in a room full of witnesses instead of a series of corridors, Lucian said, which is, at minimum, honest. A pause. You're gambling Ravenhold's position on a confrontation you can't fully control, she said. I'm gambling on knowing Varric better than he knows me, Lucian said. And on one other thing. What other thing? He held her gaze across the firelit library. That when the moment comes, he said, you'll know what to do without being told. The silence that followed was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of two people standing at the edge of an action that could not be undone, looking at each other with the specific clarity of individuals who have stopped managing what they feel in favor of being accurate about it. Outside, the afternoon light was failing over the snow, and somewhere in the lower chambers of Ravenhold, Aldrich sat in the dark with the weight of what he'd done, and somewhere beyond the cliff roads, a courier carried a forged document toward a capital that did not yet know it was being used as a weapon. And in the great hall below, servants were already arranging the tables for tomorrow's formal court gathering, when every noble of consequence in the northern territories would assemble under Ravenhold's roof and wait to see what the Duke of Ravenhold would do next. Roland Varric would be among them. Lucian had made sure of it. The invitation had been sent 3 days ago, before any of this had been in motion, back when the situation had still appeared to be something he had mapped correctly. It was the only thing about the last 48 hours that had gone exactly as planned. He intended to use it. What he did not know, what none of the intelligence, none of the analysis, none of the 20 years of building an architecture against surprise had prepared him for, was that Varric had also made sure of it. The invitation Lucian had sent 3 days ago had not been the first contact between Ravenhold and Roland Varick that week. There had been another, sent from inside the keep, signed with Lucien's seal, inviting Varick to arrive not at the formal gathering, but 12 hours before it, tonight. The second invitation reached Severin at 7 in the evening, not through any channel Lucien had authorized. Through the specific absence of a channel, a gap in the courier system's documentation, a single departure record missing from the morning logs, a seal impression that Severin had spent 40 minutes comparing against the originals before he came to Lucian's study with the kind of face that precedes information no one wants to deliver. Lucian read the copied text twice. Then he set it down on the desk with the same careful placement he'd used that morning with Severin's first report, and he stood in his study and understood that the architecture of the last 24 hours had been, in its entirety, a secondary plan. Aldrich had not been Varick's primary asset. Aldrich had been the piece Varick expected Lucien to find, the sacrifice designed to consume Lucien's attention and response capacity while the actual mechanism operated in the space that attention vacated. The forged document, the courier, the dawn timeline, all of it constructed to produce a specific reaction, and the reaction had been produced with the precision of a man who had studied Lucien Draven long enough to know exactly how he would move when he believed he understood the threat. Varick was already traveling toward Ravenhold, not tomorrow, tonight, and the invitation, signed with Lucien's seal, accessed through means that Aldrich, even now sitting in the lower chambers, had almost certainly not been responsible for, had promised him a private meeting before the court assembled. A meeting premised on Lucien's willingness to negotiate the terms of Seraphina's removal from the engagement. A meeting premised on the idea that Lucian had, in the final calculation, chosen the house over the woman. Lucian moved to the window. Outside, the darkness was complete, the kind of northern winter night that absorbed torchlight rather than reflecting it. The outer walls were visible only as a darker mass against the sky. He watched his soldiers at their posts and performed a rapid, merciless assessment of the fortress's current security state, who was where, what the response capacity was, what the internal geography meant for a man moving through Ravenhold who had been given access by invitation. Varick would not come alone. He would come with enough men to be decisive if the meeting went badly, few enough to present as a private party if it went well. 6 riders, possibly 8, armed beneath traveling cloaks. Through the front gate if the invitation held, which it would, because Lucien's gate staff would have no reason to question a sealed invitation from their lord. He had perhaps 2 hours. He called for Severin and gave him 7 specific instructions in the order of their operational priority. Severin absorbed them without visible reaction and left. Lucien watched him go and then stood alone in the study for precisely the time it took to complete the internal accounting that the situation required. He had been outmaneuvered. This was the clean fact at the center of everything, and he looked at it directly because looking at it directly was the only way it could be made useful. Varick had used Aldrich as a distraction, used Lucian's own analytical confidence against him, and was now 3 hours away from arriving at Ravenhold on terms that Varick believed he controlled. The ground had shifted. The plan Lucien had described to Seraphina, the confrontation on his terms, in a room he chose, with the engagement announcement as the stage, was no longer the plan. What was left was simpler and considerably more dangerous. He went to find her. She was not in her chambers and not in the library. He found her in the armor gallery on the 2nd floor, which was the one room in Ravenhold that most visitors did not seek out voluntarily. Too cold, too sparse. The displayed pieces chosen for historical significance rather than aesthetics. She was standing in front of a mounted cavalry sword with the quality of a person who had needed to be somewhere that required nothing of them while she thought. She heard him before he reached her and turned, and read his face with the speed of someone who had been waiting for his face to tell her something she already partially knew. "He's coming tonight," she said. "Yes." "The second invitation." "Yes." She looked at the cavalry sword for a moment, then at him. "How long?" 2 hours, less if he pushed the pace. She nodded. He watched her take the information and integrate it, and come out the other side of the integration still standing in the same place with the same quality of presence, and the steadiness of it moved through him in a way he didn't have time to examine. "What do you need me to do?" she said. "Stay in your chambers, lock the door. Marin will be outside it." Something moved across her face. "You're going to meet him." "Yes." Alone. With Severin and 4 soldiers positioned where Varric won't see them until it's relevant for him to see them. That's not alone, she said, but it's close enough. She held his gaze. Lucienne, if he comes with armed men and the meeting turns, then it turns, he said, and we handle what it turns into. That is not a plan. It's an accurate description of the available options. He moved to leave and she stepped forward, not blocking him, simply closing the distance between them until she was near enough that her voice, when she spoke, was entirely private. Don't do this because of me, she said. Don't walk into a room with Varric and give him a direct confrontation because protecting me is worth the risk. That's exactly what he wants you to do. He looked at her for a moment, at the directness of her face, the composure that was not performance, the way she was telling him not to protect her because she had assessed the situation and determined that his life was the more significant variable. I'm not doing it because of you, he said. She waited. I'm doing it because he came into my house, Lucian said, and because the moment I allow that to stand without a direct response, everything I've built for 20 years becomes a question instead of a fact. A pause. You're not the reason. You're the part that made me certain. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, come back intact. He held her gaze for 1 second that had the weight of several things that neither of them said. Then he turned and walked toward the main hall. Varric arrived at 11. Lucienne heard the gate open from the great hall's upper gallery, where he stood in the dark with Severin positioned at his shoulder, and 4 soldiers at intervals along the hall below. 2 inside the eastern archway, 2 behind the tapestries at the hall's northern end. All of them instructed to remain invisible until Lucien's signal, which was a single word. Enough. He watched from the gallery as Varric's party came through the entrance vestibule. 7 men, as he'd estimated. Cloaks on, hands visible, weapons presumably beneath, professionals who knew not to arrive looking like what they were. Varric himself was at the center, and Lucienne saw him in the torchlight of the great hall for the first time in 4 years. He had the look of a man who had been patient for so long that patience had become indistinguishable from confidence. He moved through Ravenhold's entrance with the ease of someone who had already decided, internally, that the space was his. That particular quality of ease was the thing Lucienne had been counting on. He descended the gallery stairs and entered the great hall from the upper archway. Varric saw him. For a moment neither man moved. The torches along the hall walls threw long shadows across the stone floor. The distance between them was 20 feet, which was, in terms of what could be communicated without speech, sufficient. Duke Draven, Varric said. His voice had the measured warmth of a man executing a social performance he'd rehearsed. I appreciate the private meeting. I think we're both intelligent enough to resolve this without the theater of tomorrow's court. Lucienne walked down into the hall at the same pace he walked everywhere. He stopped 10 feet from Varric and said nothing. Varric continued, which was what men did when silence made them uncomfortable. The situation with Lady Vale is unfortunate. I want you to know I take no satisfaction in it. But the accusation exists, the documentation exists, and the Crown's inquiry will proceed regardless of what you or I prefer. The question is whether Ravenhold's name is attached to the inquiry's outcome or separated from it. You're here to offer me a separation, Lucienne said. I'm here to offer you a practical path. Varric spread his hands, the gesture of a man performing reasonableness. Release her from the engagement, tonight privately, before the court assembles. I'll ensure the inquiry is directed toward the family's southern holdings rather than anything that implicates Ravenhold directly. The documentation disappears. The northern territories remain yours. Everyone moves on. Lucienne looked at him. He was aware of his own breathing, steady, slower than the situation warranted, which was not composure exactly, but the specific quality of a man whose body has understood that performance is no longer the relevant mode. He was aware of his hands, which were still. He was aware of the exact distance to Varric's nearest man, who was standing to the left at roughly 5 feet, and the distance to the eastern archway where his own soldiers waited in the dark. The forgery, Lucienne said. You're prepared to discuss that. Something moved through Varric's expression. Not surprise, he was too controlled for surprise, but the microscopic recalibration of a man who had anticipated a different opening move. I don't know what you mean by... The seal composite was taken from her traveling case, Lucienne said, which requires internal access. My intelligence has the material composition of the wax. The aging process used on the document paper is a specific technique used by a forger currently employed in the Varick Trade House's document preparation office. He paused. This is not a question about what I know. It's a question about what you'd like your answer to be before we get to the part of this conversation that you haven't planned for. Varick went still. And in the quality of that stillness, Lucien saw the thing he'd been waiting to see. The precise moment when a man who has been playing a long game encounters the edge of what his preparation had covered and has to decide in real time what he actually is without the scaffolding of the plan holding him up. "You're threatening me," Varick said, and the warmth in his voice had not entirely gone, but it had changed texture, the way water changes texture when it begins to move over rough ground. "I'm explaining the situation to you accurately," Lucien said. "There's a difference." Varick looked at him for a moment. Then something changed in the set of his shoulders, a subtle shift, a decision being made at a level below articulation, and Lucien saw it happen and understood what it meant before Varick's hand moved. "Take him," Varick said. The two men nearest Varick moved immediately, the speed of men who had been waiting for the word, and Lucien moved at the same moment, not back, not toward the archway, directly forward, inside the reach of the first man before the man had completed his draw. And what happened next was not elegant, and was not the kind of controlled response that looked good in retrospect. It was the response of a man who had spent a decade on campaigns, and had understood early that the difference between surviving and not surviving a room that had just gone wrong was the willingness to commit completely to the first move. He hit the first man with his elbow at the jaw and took the man's knife in the same motion, and the second man's blade came down across his left shoulder and opened a line through the fabric of his jacket and into the skin beneath, and the pain arrived as information rather than interruption, registered, filed, not allowed to become the primary input. "Enough," he said. The word was not loud. It didn't need to be. From the eastern archway, 2 soldiers entered. From behind the northern tapestries, 2 more, all 4 with weapons drawn, moving with the unhurried authority of men who had been waiting in exactly this position for exactly this moment and had no uncertainty about their instructions. Varick's remaining 5 men looked at the geometry of the room and performed the calculation that the geometry demanded. 3 of them lowered their weapons. 2 did not. The next 40 seconds were loud and graceless, and left 2 of Varick's men on the floor and 1 of Lucien's soldiers with a cut along his forearm that would require attention. Lucien himself took a second hit, a blow to the ribs from Varick himself, who had moved with more directness than Lucien had credited him for, and felt something grind that he decided was not broken, only badly unhappy, and adjusted his weight accordingly. When it was over, Varick was standing in the center of the great hall, with 2 of Lucien's soldiers at his sides, and his own remaining men disarmed along the eastern wall, and the torches were still burning, and the hall looked approximately like a room that had been through 30 seconds of concentrated violence, which was what it was. Lucien stood across from him. His shoulder was bleeding into his jacket. His ribs were conducting a separate conversation with him that he was declining to participate in fully. He looked at Varick across the 10 feet of stone floor and felt, with the clean precision that arrived on the other side of physical crisis, the exact weight of what he was holding. Everything Varick had built was in this room. The 10-year strategy, the patience, the careful construction of leverage points and contingencies, all of it had collapsed in 40 seconds into a man standing in someone else's house, surrounded by someone else's soldiers with his own weapons on the floor. Power, Lucien had understood from the time he was old enough to watch his father's version of it fail, was not the accumulation of capability. Anyone could accumulate capability. Power was what happened when another person looked at the situation and understood, without requiring demonstration, that the calculation was already complete. Varick was looking at the situation. The calculation was already complete. "The document," Lucien said. His voice was even, which cost him something, because his ribs were not even. "Every copy, every channel you use to distribute knowledge of it, every intermediary with access to its content." He held Varick's gaze. "You have until morning to give me the specifics. After morning, the specifics become a public record of this conversation." Varick looked at him with the expression of a man who has arrived at the end of a road he thought was longer. "You won't make this public," Varick said. "The political cost of—" "I will level every political cost this situation produces," Lucien said, and there was something in the quality of it that was not a threat so much as a simple statement of known fact. "I have done it before." I will do it with considerably less patience this time. Varric was quiet. Take him to the east wing, Lucian said to his soldiers. Not the lower chambers, the east wing. He'll be comfortable and he'll stay there until he's useful. He turned and walked back through the hall toward the stairs, and the pain in his ribs made each step a considered decision. And his shoulder was still bleeding, and somewhere above him in the locked chamber Marin was guarding, Serafina was waiting to find out what the night had produced. He was halfway up the stairs when he heard it, a sound from the corridor above. Not Marin's step, not any of his soldiers, a specific quality of movement, quick and certain, from the direction of the East Wing's alternate access corridor. The servants' passage that connected the East Wing to the guest chambers. The passage that no one would have used tonight because it had been secured hours ago. Secured by the locks that Aldrich had managed. And Aldrich, sitting in the lower chambers with no contact authorized, had still managed one thing before Severin's soldiers had reached him. He had managed it when they'd first confronted him in the map room, before Lucian had given the order. In the 40 minutes between Lucian leaving the map room and the soldiers arriving. 40 minutes. Long enough to pass a single message. The sound moved. Lucian took the remaining stairs 3 at a time, ribs delivering their protest as information he was choosing not to process, and came up into the corridor at a speed that had nothing calculated in it anymore. Stripped of the management and the strategy, and the 20 years of constructed distance from anything that required moving toward rather than away from, the corridor was dark, and the sound was ahead of him, and through the east wing passage door he could see a line of torchlight from the guest chamber beyond. A line of torchlight under a door that he had told Marin to keep locked. A door that was standing open. He crossed the corridor in 6 steps, and what he saw when he came through the doorway was not something his preparation had built a response for. Because all the intelligence and all the architecture and all the 20 years of building a system against surprise had never once needed to account for this. Marin, unconscious against the wall. 3 men he had never seen before positioned across the chamber. And Roland Varric's intermediary, the man Aldrich had named, the man Severin had been sent to locate and had not found, standing behind Serafina with a blade at her throat. She was completely still. Her eyes, when they found his across the chamber, carried the specific quality he had come to recognize as her register. Not fear. Assessment. She was looking at him the way she'd looked at everything since she'd arrived at Ravenhold. Directly, completely, waiting to see what he would do. He had Severin behind him and 2 soldiers at the stairwell. He had a knife he'd taken from Varric's man. He had a shoulder that was still bleeding and ribs that had been filing complaints for the last 4 minutes. And he had, standing across a room from him, the one situation that 20 years of building distance from anything that mattered had never needed to solve. Something he could not think his way out of. He was going to have to choose. The room had the quality of a held breath. 3 men spread across the chamber, one behind Serafina with a blade at her throat. Marin unconscious against the wall, breathing, not dead. Lucian registered this in the first second with the precision of a man who had learned to take accurate inventory of damage before deciding what the damage cost him. The intermediary, a compact man with the particular stillness of someone who had done this kind of work before and understood that stillness was its own form of pressure, held his position behind her with the professional ease of someone who had calculated the room and found his position sufficient. He was not wrong about the room. He was wrong about one thing. Lucian looked at Serafina. Her eyes were on him with the full directness of her attention, and he understood in the space of that look that she had already done what she did in every situation he'd seen her enter. She had assessed it completely, and she had arrived at a conclusion, and the conclusion was visible in the quality of her stillness, which was not the stillness of fear or of helplessness, but of someone who was waiting for a specific moment and intended to use it. She was not waiting to be rescued. She was waiting for the geometry to shift. Lucian understood this. He understood it the way he understood maps, not by thinking about them, but by reading them. The information arriving as spatial knowledge rather than verbal description. He understood that if he moved directly, the blade moved first. He understood that the 3 men positioned across the chamber were watching him and not her, because he was the variable they'd been instructed to manage. He took 1 step into the room. Varric's in the east wing, he said, to the intermediary specifically, with the quality of a man opening a conversation rather than responding to a crisis. Under guard, Whatever he promised you for this outcome, but he can't deliver it. The intermediary's eyes were steady. The outcome I'm delivering isn't for Varric. A pause. Whose is it for? Lucian said. The Crown's judicial office already has a copy of the document. Not the one your rider intercepted. The other one. A slight adjustment in his grip, not threatening, simply communicating. I have already accounted for what you think you know. Lady Vale is going to accompany me out of Ravenhold tonight. The Duke of Ravenhold is going to allow this because the alternative is a very public inquiry into the Draven House's interference with a Crown judicial process. The three men across the chamber watched him. Lucian stood in the center of the room with his bleeding shoulder and his unhappy ribs and the knife from Varric's man held loosely at his side, and he looked at the intermediary with the full attention he reserved for people who required it, and he performed in the span of approximately 4 seconds the most compressed strategic assessment of his life. The copy at the judicial office was real. He had no way to know that for certain, but the man said it with the specific quality of someone reporting a fact rather than constructing a threat, which meant it was probably true. The forgery would not survive proper examination. He knew this, but proper examination took time, and time in a Crown inquiry moved at the pace of institutional process, which was slow enough to be used as a weapon. The three men were watching him. Serafina was watching the intermediary's hand. He had Severin at his back and 2 soldiers at the stairwell. He had a knife. He had 5 days of watching a woman move through his house with the directness of someone who treated every room as territory she was genuinely allowed to occupy, who noticed a horse's favored foreleg and told a stable hand his observations mattered, who sat in his library and corrected his deliberate misdirection without making an accusation, who had offered him the clean exit on the Ridge Road and then stood in the doorway of his decision without asking him to hurry. He made his choice. He set the knife on the floor. The intermediary watched this. I want to speak to her, Lucian said. 30 seconds. Then you can do whatever you believe you've been authorized to do. A pause. The intermediary was calculating the set-down knife, the request, the quality of a man who appeared to be complying. It had the texture of compliance. It also had the texture of something else, but the intermediary was a professional, and professionals were, in Lucien's experience, susceptible to the appearance of rationality, because rationality was the mode they trusted. 30 seconds, the intermediary said. Lucien crossed the room. He stopped in front of Serafina, close enough that his voice was entirely private, and he looked at her face. The composure that was not performance, the specific quality of her attention, the fact that she was still reading the room even now, even with a blade at her throat, with the thoroughness of someone for whom understanding the situation was not separate from surviving it, but the primary instrument of it. The window behind the eastern tapestry, he said very quietly, opens inward. The latch is the upper one, not the lower one. Her eyes moved to his. A fraction. That's 12 feet to the courtyard. The woodpile is beneath it. It's been there since November. A pause that lasted less than a second. You've been planning for exit since I arrived, she said. I plan for exits in every room, he said. It's a habit. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not the trace of a smile. The real one. The one that had appeared fully exactly once, at dinner, and that he had been cataloging the absence of since without acknowledging that he was doing it. On 3, he said. She gave him nothing visible. But the quality of her stillness shifted, in a way that only someone paying the specific quality of attention he was paying would have detected, from the stillness of waiting to the stillness of ready. He straightened, turned back to the intermediary. There's one thing you should know, he said, at normal volume, with the quality of a man making a final statement before accepting a set of terms. About the copy at the judicial office. The intermediary waited. The seal composite on the forgery has a specific asymmetry in the lower quadrant, Lucien said. It was produced from an impression taken under low light, which compressed the detail on the left side. Any examiner with experience in document authentication will identify it in under an hour. He held the man's gaze. Which means the document doesn't survive scrutiny, which means everything you've been promised for tonight's outcome disappears the moment a competent examiner looks at the paper. The intermediary's eyes moved slightly, the recalibration of a man encountering information that his preparation hadn't included. 1 second? 1, Lucien said, not loudly, not particularly urgently, and moved left toward the three men across the chamber with the committed directness of a man who had made the decision a sentence ago. The room went loud. He took the first man with his shoulder, the wrong shoulder, the one that was bleeding, and the pain arrived as a white concussion behind his eyes that he moved through rather than stopping for, and used the man's own mass to take them both into the second man, and the third man's blade came for him, and he took it on his forearm instead of his throat, which was a choice he made in real time and accepted the cost of. Behind him, he heard the tapestry move, the window, the latch. He drove his elbow into the face of the second man with the complete physical commitment of someone who has stopped managing the damage register and is operating on the simpler math of whatever it takes, and heard from the direction of the door. Severin finally through, with both stairwell soldiers behind him, which meant the intermediary had turned toward the new threat, which meant he came up off the floor from the collapsed pile of the first two men and turned. The intermediary was no longer behind Serafina. He was moving toward the window. Severin's soldiers caught him before he reached it. Lucian stood in the center of the chamber in the aftermath, and the aftermath had the particular quality of all aftermaths, the sudden loud presence of sounds that the preceding intensity had made inaudible. His own breathing, the fire in the grate, Marin beginning to stir against the wall. One of Varric's men cursing with the sincere feeling of someone whose nose had just had a structural disagreement with someone else's face. The window was open. He crossed to it and looked out. Serafina was in the courtyard below, standing in the woodpile with the quality of a woman who has just dropped 12 feet into a stack of firewood and is performing an inventory of her current physical state with the methodical attention she brought to everything. She looked up. He looked down. "The upper latch," she said. "I told you." "You told me. I still wasn't entirely certain until I tried it." A pause, in which she stepped down from the woodpile with the careful movement of someone whose ankle had opinions. "Is it over?" He looked at the courtyard, the gate, the outer walls, the soldiers at their posts, the snow falling in the torchlight with the indifferent patience of weather that had no interest in the outcomes of the people it fell on. "Yes," he said. It was, as it turned out, the most accurate thing he had said in 5 days. The hour that followed was logistics. Severin moved with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this work long enough that the aftermath of a contained crisis was simply a list of sequential tasks. The intermediary was secured. Varric's men were consolidated in the east wing, Varric himself now understanding with the particular clarity of a man who has exhausted his options that the terms of his situation were no longer his to negotiate. A rider was dispatched to intercept the second courier. A message was prepared for the Crown's judicial office, not a denial of the document's existence, which would have been both false and transparent, but a detailed technical analysis of the forgery's material composition, signed by Lucian and countersigned by 2 members of his household staff, with documented expertise in document examination, the kind of immediate proactive submission that made an inquiry's outcome predictable. Lucien let Severin manage the list. He sat in the map room with his arm dressed and his shoulder restaged, and his ribs wrapped in the pragmatic manner of a military physician who had stopped pretending that the Duke was going to slow down on the basis of medical recommendation. The fire was high. The maps on the walls were the same maps they had always been. The trade routes and campaign lines and territorial boundaries of a kingdom that had spent the last 5 days being used as the board for a game that was now, substantially, over. Serafina came in at midnight. She had changed out of the gown. She was in the practical dark clothes she'd arrived in 5 days ago, which he recognized as a choice that was either comfort or a bookending he couldn't fully interpret yet. She sat across from him in the map room's second chair and looked at his arm and did not perform sympathy about it, which was, of all the possible responses, the one he was most capable of receiving. "Marin," he said, awake, furious about it. A slight pause. "She told me the man who hit her was going to regret it specifically, and at length, once she felt better." "She'll arrange it herself," Lucien said. "She doesn't need my involvement in that category." "I know." Something in her voice had a quality he hadn't heard before. Not softer exactly, but carrying a weight that was different from the assessed directness of their previous conversations. "She told me something else." He waited. "She said she's served you for 11 years, and she has never once, in that time, seen you set down a weapon voluntarily." A pause. She said she saw it from the corridor, before Severin came through. Lucien looked at the fire. She said it scared her more than anything else that happened tonight, Serafina said, because she didn't recognize it. He was quiet for a moment. Did you recognize it? She said. He turned his gaze from the fire to her. The firelight was on her face with the quality it had had in the library that first night, and she was looking at him with the full directness that was her register, and the question she'd asked had the same quality as all her questions, treating the answer as something genuinely unknown rather than a confirmation of something already concluded. Yes, he said. She held his gaze. Tell me. He sat with this for a moment, not deflecting it, not managing it, but actually sitting with it the way he had learned in the last 5 days was the only kind of sitting with things that produced anything true. I built everything here on the principle that distance is safety, he said, that the further you are from anything that can be taken from you, the more complete your control. He looked at the maps on the wall, the routes he had studied for 20 years, the territories he had consolidated, the architecture of authority he had constructed with the precision of a man who had watched what happened when authority was built on anything less durable than cold calculation. My father believed in things, believed in people, trusted the wrong ones, and then the right ones, and couldn't tell the difference until after, and that inability destroyed him. He paused. I decided I wouldn't believe in anything I couldn't verify. And then, she said, and then you walked into a room and looked directly at me, he said, and I spent 5 days trying to verify you and discovered that the verification process was producing a result I hadn't built a category for. She was still looking at him. What result? She said, and her voice was quiet and completely unperformed. That the most dangerous thing in this fortress, he said, wasn't Roland Varick or Aldrich or the forged document or the man with a blade at your throat. It was the specific sensation of watching you make the calculation about whether to tell me about Varick's approach, weighing whether honesty served you better than strategy, and choosing honesty not because it was safe, but because you decided I was worth the cost of it. He held her gaze. Nobody has made that calculation about me in 20 years. Most people don't make it at all. The fire, the maps, the snow against the high windows with its indifferent patience. I set down the knife, he said, because you were in that room, and because there are things that don't have a strategic answer. And I am not comfortable with that. I want to be precise about that. I am not comfortable with the absence of a strategic answer, but I've spent 5 days watching you operate in conditions that were not comfortable and not safe and never once watched you become smaller to survive them. He stopped. Which told me, he said more quietly, something I needed to know about what it looks like to be large enough for the actual size of a situation. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, my father told me when I left Thornfield that I was walking into a negotiation, that everything was a transaction, and my job was to understand what the other party needed well enough to make the transaction favorable. She looked at the fire. He's not wrong. He's just describing a smaller version of how people work. A pause. Transactions are what happen when two people don't trust each other enough to be honest about what they actually want. He looked at her. What do you actually want? He said. She turned from the fire to him, and the quality of her gaze had the same unguarded openness he had seen in the library that first night when she'd asked him about the unnamed portrait. Not the assessed directness of a woman managing a situation, but the complete presence of a person who had decided to be accurate about the things that were true. I want, she said carefully, to be somewhere that the quality of my attention is received as what it actually is, rather than threat assessed and filed under tactical asset. A pause. I want to sit in someone's map room at midnight and be asked a real question, and give a real answer, and have the answer matter beyond its strategic utility. She held his gaze. I want to be known by someone who is capable of being known in return. Which is, she added, with the trace of something at the corner of her mouth, a considerably more specific requirement than it sounds, because most people who want to know you are actually interested in a version of you that confirms something they've already decided. He was quiet. I know, she said. I'm aware this is not how this conversation was supposed to go. How was it supposed to go? I assumed you would tell me the threat was neutralized and the engagement would proceed on the original terms, and we would both perform the appropriate level of relief and then return to being intelligent adults who were making a rational arrangement. And instead, And instead you told me why you set down the knife, she said, which is either the most tactically inadvisable thing you've done in this entire situation or the first genuinely free decision you've made in 20 years. I'm not certain which. He looked at her for a long moment. I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive, he said. Something settled in the room. Not the resolution of tension exactly, more the quality of a structure that has been under load finally finding the configuration in which the weight is genuinely distributed rather than just contained. He reached across the table and set his hand over hers. Not a gesture. Not a performance of any of the things that gestures of that kind usually performed. Simply the movement of a man who had spent 20 years building distance from anything that could be taken from him, making the specific choice to close one particular distance, with full knowledge of what that choice cost and the full intention of paying it. She looked at his hand. Then she turned hers over. The morning of the formal court gathering arrived with the quality of winter mornings in the Northern Territories, cold, clear, indifferent to the events it was about to illuminate. Ravenhold's great hall filled by 10 with the assembled nobility of the Northern Territories, every significant house represented by at least one senior member. The atmosphere carrying the particular compound of curiosity and calculation that gathered wherever the Duke of Ravenhold was about to make a public statement. They had heard things. The precise accounts varied by source, but the broad shape was consistent. Something had happened the night before. Varric had been in the keep. Men had been detained. The nature of the events remained opaque, which was, in its own way, more alarming than specific information. Lucien entered the hall from the upper archway at 10 past 10. He was impeccably dressed. The arm was not visible as an injury. The shoulder was. He had not attempted to conceal it, which was itself information. A man who concealed his wounds was a man who needed people to believe he had none. Lucien Draven had never required that particular belief from anyone. Serafina entered from the lateral corridor and took her position beside him, and there was something in the quality of that positioning. Not behind him, not at a formal distance, simply beside him, with the unhurried ease of someone standing where they had decided to stand, that reorganized the room's understanding of what they were looking at before a single word was spoken. Lucien looked at the assembled court. Last night, he said without preamble, without the warm framing that political announcements typically employed, Roland Varric entered this fortress under a forged invitation and attempted to remove Lady Serafina Vale through coercion, on the basis of a document that was itself a forgery. The forgery has been documented and submitted to the Crown's Judicial Office with full material analysis. Varric is currently a guest of this house pending that process. He let a moment pass. Lord Aldrich, who served this household for 9 years, provided internal access in exchange for considerations from Varric's network. He will be dealt with according to the terms that apply to such situations. The hall was completely silent. This engagement, he said, will proceed. He did not explain it further. He did not offer the political framing or the reassurance of strategic rationale or any of the packaging that made difficult announcements easier to receive. He stated the fact and let it stand, the way he let all facts stand, on their own weight, without assistance. The court received it. What the court could not receive was what it had no framework for because the Duke of Ravenhold had not provided a framework for it in 20 years, was the specific quality of the silence that followed. Not the silence of a decree being accepted, the silence of a room full of people who were, in the way people absorb things that changed their understanding of something they thought they knew, quietly revising something. Lord Perrin Castle, who was standing in the third row and had heard Serafina's response to his corridor approach 5 days ago, replayed in detail by 3 separate witnesses, found himself thinking about the particular arithmetic of a man who had built an empire on the principle of unreachable distance, and had apparently, in the course of 1 week, located something worth the cost of the distance. Cassell was not a sentimental man, but he was an accurate one. He thought, this changes the calculation. He was right. In the weeks that followed, the formal inquiry moved with the deliberate pace of Crown processes, and the forgery's provenance was established with the thoroughness of documentation that had been prepared by a man who had spent 20 years making sure his evidence was irrefutable before he acted on it. Varric's network in the Northern Territories collapsed in the specific way that networks collapse when their central node loses credibility. Not all at once, but sequentially, each component reassessing its own position once the protective architecture of the whole was gone. Aldrich stood before a closed proceeding and said what he knew in full, which was, in its own particular way, the most useful service he had ever performed for the house he'd served and then betrayed, and then, in the accounting, made the only restitution available to him. Lucien did not attend the proceeding. He was on the eastern ridge when it concluded, on horseback in the early spring light that was finally beginning to assert itself against the northern cold. Serafina was beside him, on a horse that was no longer favoring its left foreleg, the farrier having been seen and the problem resolved with the thoroughness of things that were attended to because someone had noticed and considered it worth the attention. The ridge looked different in the light that was neither winter nor spring, but the specific quality of the transition between them. When the landscape was beginning to remember what it was before the cold came, the shapes of things becoming clear again beneath the snow's recession. "Aldrich," she said. "Yes." "He was wrong," she said, "about what he thought he was protecting." "He was wrong about what I was protecting," Lucien said. "There's a difference." She looked at him. "He thought your judgment had been compromised," she said. "My judgment was changed," Lucien said. "Those are not the same condition." He looked at the ridge, the territory below it, the shape of the kingdom in the early light. Compromised judgment is what happens when something interferes with your capacity to assess accurately. Changed judgment is what happens when your assessment is accurate and the conclusion is different from what you expected. She was quiet for a moment. "And what is the conclusion?" she said. He looked at her in the light that was neither winter nor spring. "That I built everything here on the assumption that connection was a liability," he said. "That the only safe position was one from which nothing could be taken, which meant holding nothing, which is a coherent strategy." He paused. "It's also a description of a very large, very cold, very empty fortress." Something in her face opened slightly, not softened. She was not a person who softened, and he had come to understand that this was not a deficiency, but a form of respect for the people she was with, a refusal to make things easier by making them less true. "Ravenhold is still fairly cold," she said. "Yes," he said, "we'll keep that. The cold is structural." The trace at the corner of her mouth arrived and stayed. He reached across the distance between their horses, and she met him halfway, which was, in the end, the only geometry that had ever worked for either of them. Not one person crossing the full distance while the other waited, not two people standing at opposite walls conducting their exchange across the room, but the specific mathematics of two people who had both decided, at the same moment, that the distance was worth crossing. Below them, Ravenhold stood on its cliff against the pale sky, and the spring was coming whether the northern cold consented or not. And the kingdom was entering a period of recalibration that would take years to fully settle. The redistribution of alliances, the quiet acknowledgement of the new balance of things, the slow adjustment of every house, and holding in the north to the reality of what the Draven name now meant, and what it was attached to. Lucien would spend those years the way he had spent every year before them, with precision and patience and the thorough preparation of a man who took the shape of things seriously enough to study them. The difference was that he would not be spending them alone. Not because he had been convinced of the strategic value of alliance, though the strategic value was real, and he was not naive enough to pretend it wasn't a factor. Not because the arrangement served Ravenhold's political interests, though it did, and he was not sentimental enough to pretend that was irrelevant, but because somewhere between a library and a map room and a corridor and an eastern ridge in the last light of winter, he had made the only discovery that his 20 years of thorough preparation had never quite arrived at. That the thing he'd been building all this time, the fortress, the network, the architecture of unreachable authority, was not, in the end, something that could be completed alone. Not because he lacked the capability, because completion required someone who would look at what he'd built and see it accurately. The parts that were genuine and the parts that were compensation for something older. The parts that were strength and the parts that were the specific shape that fear makes when it has enough resources to look like confidence. He had spent 20 years making sure no one could get close enough to see the difference. She had seen it in 11 days, and she had not looked away. The horses moved along the ridge in the early spring light, and below them, Ravenhold kept its position on the cliff, with the particular permanence of things that have been built to outlast the people who built them. And the wind moved across the northern territories with its habitual patience, and the Duke of Ravenhold rode beside the woman who would become its Duchess, not in the silence of management, but in the silence of two people who had nothing left to conceal from each other. It was by every measure he had ever used to assess such things, the most dangerous position he had ever occupied. It was also, with the precise accuracy he brought to everything that mattered, the only one he had no intention of leaving.